Welcome to T&D Talk, a special series on the T&D World Line Life podcast channel. For each episode, companies can share their stories about how they are supporting the electric utility industry. Through their tools, technologies, products, and services, they are helping line workers and field workers improve their productivity and safety. This podcast episode focuses on innovations in transmission and distribution to ensure reliability and resiliency. Our guest is Charles Holcomb, Director of Overhead Systems and Solutions for Southwire. Charles leads utility applications engineering, new product development, conductor characterization lab software functions, and product line management for differentiated overhead conductors. Since joining Southwire in 2007, Charles held multiple positions in utility new product development and applications engineering. Charles is a leading expert on overhead transmission and distribution conductor systems. He is a member of IEEE, CGRE, and chairs ASTM B01. He holds his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Georgia. He also holds 8 U.S. patents in the utility transmission and distribution space, along with numerous others internally. Charles, thanks for joining us today for this episode of T&D Talk.
Hey, it's great to be with you this afternoon.
Charles, let's start with the issue of transmission congestion. As our society is starting to use more data, we're seeing a need for more data centers. Also, we're facing a growth in population and a transformation in the automotive market. How do we ensure a reliable grid moving forward with the challenges we see from a growth standpoint?
Great question. Certainly an interesting time to be in the energy space. We have a saying at Southwire: it's a great time to be in the electrical industry, and an even better time to be at Southwire. And I certainly believe that to be the case. And we see the specific dynamic of what's going on in a very specific way at Southwire, and we call it the congruency of power. But essentially, within the energy space, you have delivery, you have generation, you have consumption. And consumption, of course, is usage. Generation, obvious, and then delivery is transmission, in bulk, of course, transmission distribution. And, the term congruency really, pertains to a necessitated balance of the generation, delivery, and consumption so that we can, ensure reliability, efficiency, safe operation, of our electrical grid. And if any one of these three things, certainly, imbalanced, you can't grow, you can't ensure these properties, you can't, again, ensure a reliable grid. And so we're now starting to see a real pickup or growth in consumption, right? And what's that growth? You mentioned it. The big growth right now is data center. We're a data centric, society, and that need is growing more and more. We see more and more data centers going in, which creates a real challenge because all of a sudden you can put this consumption on the grid of, a gigawatt at a time. And the big challenge is, you can do it very quickly. You can build a data center in 18, 24 months, where generation is certainly going to lag that. You can't build generation that fast. And the same thing with transmission lines. Typically, it's going to take quite a while to build a brand new transmission line. So we've got a real problem ahead of us to solve, as an industry. And it's going to take an industry approach to really crack this nut.
Thank you, Charles. You made excellent points there. And now let's move on to aging assets. How can we better use technology to deliver on the goal to add more capacity to transmission networks?
Well, certainly, that's a key aspect of this problem. Like I talked about, the congruency of power is aging assets. And there's been a number of studies recently done on these transmission networks, and some of them are getting, quite old. For example, for the older products, invented in 1909 is ACSR conductor, aluminum conductor, steel reinforced, for those who aren't familiar. Some of these conductors are starting to celebrate, or already have celebrated, their 100-year anniversary. And now certainly a lot of these conductors have come down, but these things were built in a way to where, unless you have some sort of need to take them down, they can last for 40, 50, 60 plus years. And so with that, and with these type conductors being out in the atmosphere and the elements being operated, at times it really, it becomes a bit of a challenge. So that's challenge number one is those aging assets, but also when it comes to capacity, you mentioned capacity on the transmission network. A lot of these older conductors are lower temperature conductors, lower capacity conductors, and now we're seeing substantial load growth, and that's part of another part to where we need to react as an industry and take action.
Excellent. Now let's talk a little bit about the length of time it takes to build a new transmission line. We've heard that it typically takes about 7 to 10 years. How can utilities better use existing corridors for transmission and distribution? And can you also discuss how advanced conductors and reconductoring can shorten the timelines to add capacity? Charles, how can we add more capacity through existing right of ways to reduce the time horizon to deal with the transmission congestion issue?
And so you really hit the nail on the head. When we were talking at the very beginning of that balance between generation, delivery, and consumption. Once we see imbalance of consumption, again, we've got to act. And the way we act to add additional capacity is build new lines, right? But as you mentioned, a new line can take 7 to 10 years. We simply just don't have the time to wait. Just seeing the pace in which data centers are being built, we don't have time to wait to be able to build these transmission lines out. So the only option that we have is to use our existing right of ways. And so, what's important to really understand about these existing right of ways, and I always make a joke when I'm presenting at different industry groups, is God's not making any more land, right? We've really got to better utilize what we have. We have these spaces that are already earmarked for transmission, and the only way to do it is to use those right of ways. And the only way to increase capacity in those right of ways in a reasonable amount of time is to use a different type conductor. Now, for example, if you were to want to add capacity with he's using ACSR, and ACSR is a great conductor. It's the lion's share of what's on our network today. However, it's a low temperature conductor with limited capacity. If you were to use that and go to a larger conductor, you would be okay. Now I've got to build larger structures. I've got to build larger foundations, which means taking those right of ways, expanding them out, which is really where that time component comes in. However, these days, we have newer conductors out there, which, we're referring to as an advanced conductor, but it's really like a high temperature conductor category that we could take down the old conductors. We put up the new conductor and we could ensure 2 to even almost 3 times the capacity of those lower temperature conductors. And the kicker is, as with these conductors, you can put in a conductor the same diameter. You can put in a conductor that's going to run at a much higher temperature, but it's going to sag the same or better than the lower temperature ACSR component or conductor. And so essentially, it's a pure reconductor option, limited to no structural modifications of transmission structures. Conductor diameter doesn't change, so you don't have to change the wind load, the ice load that's acting on the conductor or acting on the structure. So purely a reconductor option that we have, that we have the ability to use. And again, just reconductoring, no right of way changes. Little to no permitting that's needed. Utilities just love the word permitting, right? They love the word, expanding right away. I am totally sarcastic here, but just kind of knocking down those barriers with a new conductor type is really the way to do it.
And Charles, now can you describe the different technologies currently available for advanced conductors and their features and benefits?
Certainly. And so when we talk about advanced conductors, there's really two buckets that I'm going to put them in. One is the earliest advanced conductor that's out there. It was actually invented in the mid 70s. It's called ACSS, aluminum conductor steel supported. But ultimately, it operates at high temperature. It's come a long way from its initial inception. New steel alloys have been created so we can match the strength of the old conductor. And additionally, Manufacturing processes have been refined. So this ACSS has actually come such a long way that now it installs, very easily. It's very well known, but again, it could get you twice the capacity of an ACSR conductor. So that happened in the mid 70s. The development of the different steel cores to accommodate that technology and really build it out came along, later in the 90s. And then that process in which we call batch annealing of ACSS came along, say mid 90s into the early 2000s. So now it's a really great advanced conductor, well known, well used, been used for years on networks within the US. And then more recently, and starting in about 1995, we started looking at composite core conductors. And so there's different types of composite core conductors out there, but again, putting them in two buckets. One, there's a more of a metal-based composite core, which was the early, mid 90s. And then after that, there was a polymer composite core. So of the polymer composite cores, there's two types. So again, another two buckets, a monolith core, which meaning one strength member, and then there's a multi-strand core, so multiple strength members, usually seven strength members in the core. So these new technologies, they started coming onto the scene, early 2000s, into, just after 2010, 15 time period. But now we're getting to a point to where the utilization of these composite cores is starting to take off. The utility industry is typically very conservative, and they want to evaluate technology before they start implementing it. It could take a while, but now we're getting to a point to where some of the thought leaders within the space are really adopting these technologies. They understand it. They understand it's reliable, and they're ready to start using this technology to accomplish the goal on their own networks.
Very good. And now let's talk about safety when it comes to conductoring related to the installation and operation of the new conductor. What, if any, work practice changes should users expect when reconductoring with advanced conductors?
And so, I mean, this is, by far the most important question we can ask is how do we approach safety with these new things? Because if anything changes, we should say, okay, what changes with our work practices? What changes with our approach so that we can safely put these things up? We can operate them over a 40 to 60 to plus, year lifespan and without incident. And certainly from a safety standpoint, I think safety begins from the design stage, right? It's all about, which technology do we choose, the different manufacturers, there's a couple out there, but which technology to choose to align with, which ultimately, creates that safest approach. And so, when I design anything, that's structural, I want what I call structural redundancy. I want to make sure that if something were to go wrong and fail, there's something else that can catch it. We also call it like a safety factor and things like that. Now, when we have evaluated this technology, over a period of about a 10-year time frame, we said the best way to go about this is with a multi-strand approach, right? There's different technologies out there, but the multi-strand approach is the best for a couple reasons. One, you have seven strength members that make up the core of the conductor. And then the comment I need to make as well is the outside of the conductor. Some conductors will carry a mechanical load in the aluminum, a substantial one, but the vast majority of this conductor, it's soft aluminum. So, which means the tensile strength is very low, and the contribution of the aluminum is very low. It's generally between 70 and 30% of its rated breaking strength. So it really tells us that, hey, we really need to make sure this core is very strong, is very reliable, and has a lot of structural redundancy because the tensions at which these conductors see over their lifespan would be anywhere between, at the very start, 10% of rated breaking strength. When you tension it, 20% of rated breaking strength, but during operation, up to 60, 70, or I've even seen 80%. of the strength of these conductors, right, is utilized during the operation. So essentially, if you don't have structural redundancy within your core and then you rely on the aluminum alone, this conductor will fail. And so failure for Southwire is not an option. We said to ourselves, safety, reliability, these two things are the most important thing to our customers. They're the most important thing to us, even before performance. It's a non-negotiable for us that we were going to take a safe approach to design of these conductors. So you have the design aspect, and then when you go to okay, let's install it. Well, can we safely install these things? It needs to be flexible. It needs to be rigid, strong, robust. Well, again, it starts with the design. A multi-strand approach is very flexible. It's more forgiving during installation, where a more rigid core, a less structurally redundant core may or may not be all that reliable during installation. And then finally, the rigors of operating the conductor over these years. The two biggest things that are the two main failure modes for an ACSR conductor are aluminum annealing and corrosion over its lifetime. And so certainly we have engineered out those two among others, reducing the risk as much as possible for a new technology. These polymer composite multi-strand cores, they are best in class when it comes to corrosion resistance. And then utilizing soft aluminum, like I said, in one version, you really can't, anneal the aluminum to lose strength because it's already deeply annealed when you manufacture it. There is another version out there that's a harder aluminum, but it's a higher temperature aluminum to where within the operating range of the conductor, you cannot anneal the aluminum of, within reasonable temperature range. So again, completely engineering out the possibility for these two failure modes to exist moving forward.
Well, it's wonderful to hear about your focus on safety because our Line Life podcast listeners are all about safety. So that's great to hear. And now, can you discuss the regulatory requirements for grid enhancing technologies in the transmission space, like FERC 881 and dynamic line ratings, and how they could impact reconductoring going forward?
So certainly an interesting thing going on with FERC 881 to begin with, and essentially there's a lot of things in FERC 881. I won't start to go through that because we don't have 6 hours of podcast time. But essentially, we've moved to a new ratings methodology for these conductors where utilities are required to adopt ambient adjusted ratings. So essentially, um, putting the ratings of these conductors into different pockets that they would utilize throughout the day. That's the step one. But ultimately, where I see the industry headed, and FERC is, again, I can't read the crystal ball here for us, but FERC has already issued, and we call it a NOPE or advance notice regarding potentially, requiring the use of DLR, which is dynamic line ratings of these conductors, these advanced conductors. So essentially what dynamic line rating is really understanding what the conductor temperature is by direct measurement or by calculation at a much more higher frequency way of going about it instead of the typical process would be, you know, an equation we use, IEEE 738, where we tried to estimate the time temperature relationship of conductors. Here, essentially, with DLR, you're measuring the temperature of the conductor. And then let me answer the question. Why do you want to know what the temperature of the conductor is? Because you want to be able to operate it as high temperature as possible, more capacity, but also as safe as possible. You don't want to exceed the thermal limits of the different materials in the conductor, which would cause it to fail early, earlier than life, or even substantially shorten the life of the conductor. Again, these things are designed to be in place for 40, 50, 60 plus years. And so we want to make sure and operate them as safe as possible. And so that's where this technology, it kind of goes hand in hand in a way with utilization of advanced conductors within the space. Again, trying to better harness the assets that we have, understanding what's the actual conductor temperature, and then ultimately, what's the demonstrated capacity of these lines within a space to where that we can operate them safely. So, end of the day, we want to be able to put more ampacity down the lines. And some ways it's, hey, let's put sensors on the line to really enhance that grid enhancing technology. Or do we reconductor because we need, 2 to 3 times that capacity? Or do we do both? So that way we really understand where we are thermally on these new conductors, and we can operate them in a way to where they're safe, they're reliable, for a full life.
Very good. And Charles, do you have any other comments about innovations in transmission or distribution to ensure a more reliable grid?
Well, certainly, I mean, one of the things that we constantly look at Southwire is, what's next. And I'm not at liberty to share any, intellectual property at this point, but please, rest assured that, we're constantly looking at technologies that are out there. We're constantly looking at new technologies that we can deploy into the T&D space, ultimately to better serve our customers and to better serve the market, because we've got a real challenge ahead of us for how we build out the grid and ensure that congruency of power moving forward as we face the challenges of just growing consumption. And again, won't speak about the generation side that needs to come along, but certainly we're looking at new technology so that we could put our best foot forward and we could really prepare our customers for the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of T&D Talk. We enjoyed hearing about the technologies available to help electric utilities to improve resiliency and reliability and increase capacity.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Charles.